Guys coming back from the war were self-medicating. They were haunted by what they had seen. There was a lot of physical abuse. There was a lot of depression. And then there were the mothers who were just like my mom. They were brilliant. They were talented. They were awesome. And there was no outlet for what they did. And there was huge amounts of alcoholism among those women and drug abuse. Nobody talked about it.
Your mom was a very typical of her era, stay-at-home mom. How do you think she felt about having to take that role?
My mother knew that the 50s were an aberration. She grew up completely poor. Her father died when she was 12. She had a single mother, who was a washerwoman, who barely spoke English. Everybody worked in the family because they had to keep a roof over my grandmother's head. She worked all through high school, and then she wanted to be a doctor, and she somehow got into college, into New York City College. So she wants to be a doctor. She can't be. She meets my father. They get married. He's a doctor. She's a brilliant woman. She's absolutely stunningly brilliant. She really wanted to make something of her life. She was determined to make something of her life. Here comes the 50s. If she had a job then, and I don't know that she did, I think she was busy having babies, she would have gotten kicked out of her job. So here she is in the 50s, using that brilliant mind to raise a bunch of noisy kids. She has no outlet for how smart she is. And she would say to us occasionally, "You have no idea how good you have it." She knew that this was not typical. She did not live in a house. She did not have food security. She did not have a mother who stayed home to take care of the family. Her mother took in wash. I know that being in that role was incredibly destructive to her. And then it became incredibly destructive to us because she was so angry. She was so depressed. She was so angry. She was so frustrated. It was wrong. It was unsuitable to her. My father had grown up in a family that was much better off. They had 2 generations to build some wealth. And he played golf, and he taught her how to play golf. And it turned out that she was like a pro quality golfer because she was a great athlete. Once she figured out she could be really good at this, her whole life changed. She needed to be good at something. She needed to be good at something other than figuring out the wallpaper. When she found that out, her life changed. She went all over New York City and the metropolitan area winning golf tournaments. And we were so proud of her. And I think of the people who say we really needed a mother staying at home and all this. At a certain point, we could have taken care of ourselves. And we would have been much happier with a happy mother than with a mother who was so frustrated that she would take us to school and run out and play golf and then try to get home before we got home from school. That was crazy. And it made her crazy. And it made her angry. And she took it out on the family. And that happened to a lot of women.
Yeah, I mean, that's the other side of this era, of course, right? Because on the one hand, you've got sort of an unprecedented amount of abundance. America is the last country standing, basically, after World War II. But you've also got a society that's extremely regimented, social structure. And I imagine that there was a lot of repression and a lot of things going on in families under the surface because of that regimented structure.
Oh my God. Nobody talked about it, and of course divorce was unacceptable in Catholic families. So people stayed together regardless of how detrimental and harmful it was to the family. It wasn't until I got to college and met women from all over the Eastern Seaboard who had been, raised in Catholic families that I realized how widespread dysfunction was. Alcoholic fathers, guys coming back from the war were self-medicating because nobody would talk about it because that was considered being a coward. But, they were haunted by what they had seen. There was a lot of physical abuse. There was a lot of depression in that generation, and those kids had to live with that. And then there were the mothers who were just like my mom. They were brilliant. They were talented. They were awesome. And there was no outlet for what they did. And there was huge amounts of alcoholism among those women and drug abuse, prescription drug abuse. They were always taking uppers. I mean, the 50s were built on the backs of housewives. You couldn't have had the 50s if you didn't have a permanent class of indentured servants who got no money for what they did, who weren't eligible for Social Security for what they did, even though what they did was incredibly important and valuable and should have had a dollar sign, posted on it. And, those women paid the price for the prosperity that everyone has nostalgia for. And the other thing that, of course, it was built on was a massive infusion of money, of government money, to make that prosperity possible. That was another thing that was completely invisible at the time. We just thought it's always been this way, it'll always be this way. And that's not true. It had never been that way before. And women had always been in the workplace because they needed to. I mean, my mother worked her entire life. And then she becomes a housewife, and she wanted to work, but she couldn't. The jobs were crappy and they didn't pay well, and she would have gotten fired because she was bossy and smarter than everybody else, I mean, it was a false prosperity in some ways. I mean, it was real and we experienced it as real, but you have to, when you take it apart, you really realize it was a moment in time.
One of the things that makes the 1950s possible is that there's a massive amount of spending from the federal government that is giving opportunities to the GIs specifically. You've got the GI Bill that provides the education for millions of people. You've got low interest VA home loans.
Right.
But of course, the way that this program was implemented, those resources were only available, in essence, to white men. It wasn't shared equally among the population.
I'm sure it wasn't. I would guess that a single woman applying for a home loan through the GI Bill, I mean, I can't even imagine that would be allowed. You couldn't even have credit as a woman, so I don't even know how they would give a loan to you.
It's interesting because, you've got the 50s where the default is for women to stay home, but 5 years earlier, the country asked women to join the labor force in massive numbers. So I'm looking at some statistics here. In 1945, 37% of the domestic workforce was women. And then by 1950, it's down to 30%. So you have all these women who helped participate in the effort to defeat, fascism, and then they're asked to go back into the kitchen. And I'm wondering what the psychological toll of ignoring their sort of contribution was.
I mean, I'll tell you, it had a massive psychological impact on us once we entered into the late 60s. I mean, I have a poster on my wall, which you can't see right now, of Rosie the Riveter. We knew nothing about Rosie the Riveter until the late 60s, when women's history started. Women say, hey, you have a history here that you really ought to know about, And I got a flyer once from a group that wanted to do a museum dedicated to the women who flew planes all over the country for the Army, the women pilots who took the place of the men who couldn't, who were at war. Women did every job, and they did it brilliantly. I mean, they ran the whole war effort, and they were fantastic at it. And Black people joined it. It's just like everything else. There's talent wherever you look, if you just look for it. And then the war ends. The Selective Service Act requires employers to fire people and give the soldiers their jobs back. So if they had a job before the war, they would just fire whoever was in the position. So you had millions of people whose work was respected and who made a decent living being told, get out of here and go back to the kitchen, or go to the kitchen. You weren't in the kitchen before, but now you're going to be in the kitchen. And there was government propaganda that did it, and the newsreels that encouraged it, and then the tax code encouraged it, and everything encouraged it. And these women were like, well, what are we supposed to do? We can't get loans. We can't get a decent job. What are we supposed to do? So we were very angry on their behalf. Like 20 years later, we were pissed. They called us feminazis. But really what we were doing was we were just reclaiming history that they just conveniently wanted to throw into the garbage can. Like, let's forget all those women who helped win the war and were pilots and all those other things. Let's just forget about them. We want you to be the backbone of the prosperity in the 50s by holding down the fort in the home while the men get all the jobs. Get out of the labor force. Stop competing with the men. Stay at home. We don't care how smart you are, how talented you are, how brilliant you are, how much the society loses from keeping you in that role. We don't care, because a stupid man is more valuable than two brilliant women. And so when you think of going back to the 50s, what these 2025 people think about really is they don't just want children that obey their parents. They want women to be indentured servants again. Their view of like the roles in society are women's job is caretakers, and anybody who steps out of that role is a bitch, a feminazi. If you just say, God gave me all these gifts, why can't I use them just like you? That's just blasphemy and heresy. Your job is to be a mother and a caregiver. They just want to go back to this time where there was this enforced indentured servitudes, like, you'll be in this role and you'll like it. Women liked it in the 50s. Like, no, they didn't. The rates of alcoholism, drug addiction, and physical abuse in the families were out of this world, and depression and psychological problems and all this kind of stuff were out of this world because a lot of women didn't want that role. Some women did. Good for them. Stay at home, and I got no problem with that. But don't stop me from doing it if I want to follow a different path. So when people talk about going back to the 50s, we're not going back there. What we should go back to is a time when the government said, we want to invest in the middle class. I'm all about that. The 50s would never have happened without that. Just like if there had been no fault divorce, the 50s would never have happened if there had been no fault divorce. Women would have been able to get out of these, horrific marriages. And then what would the culture have done? It would have had to have adjusted.
Now Project 2025 is trying to make it illegal to have a no-fault divorce.
Of course they are, because they also want women to stay home. They also are attacking birth control, force women into marriages and force them to have children once they're in the marriage, because they won't be able to use birth control. Because they want workers, and they want workers because that's cheap labor. The more babies you have, that's the more labor. The more labor there is, more competition for fewer jobs, the cheaper the laborer has to agree to, just like we were 100 years ago. That it's no accident that those things all go together. Of course they go together. In the old days when you didn't have no-fault divorce, if you were Catholic, you couldn't get out. You could get an annulment, but that was only for the Kennedys, and rich people with connections to the Archbishop. You had to fly to Las Vegas and live in a motel for 6 weeks and get residency and then get a divorce under the Las Vegas laws, and then take it back to your state and hope the state would acknowledge it, which some of them didn't. Or you could hire, one of the divorce mills to stage infidelity, where the husband would go rent a hotel room and get in bed with a woman, and the photographer would rush in and take a picture. Then the wife could say, oh, I'm suing on grounds of infidelity. And of course, everyone knew it was all perjury. The judge knew, the lawyers knew, the photographer knew, everybody. There were companies that just did this. So there's always a way around it, but only for women of means.
Right.
But we're not going back there. It's too late. I just hope that American women wake up enough to realize that some of us remember when those bad old days existed and women were trapped in those loveless marriages and abusive marriages, and that, it could come back. There are people who want you back in those situations, and, you have the power to stop it. And don't think it can't happen, because it can and it will if you don't wake up.
Thanks so much for watching, everyone. That was a clip from one of our full episodes, so if you want to hear more of that discussion, please click the link on your screen. And if you're enjoying these discussions, please like and subscribe and let us know what you think in the comments. And please consider supporting us on Patreon, where you can get early access to our videos and bonus content. Patreon.com/talkingpoliticswithmom. Thanks so much, everybody, and we'll see you next time.